Salam, peace be upon you and the mercy and blessings of God. My name is Muhammad Laykh Sadiqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. It is one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as kappa, and motion as nu, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we seal one of the most dangerous holes a human mind can fall through. Today we enter episode 11, the metagrammar, the part of holophase where science learns how to protect truth from human confusion, from memory drift, and even from our own future selves. This chapter is about a surprisingly practical weapon in that protection system, the tautology detection gate. The problem sounds technical, but it is painfully ordinary. A statement can sound like a law, look like a law, and even feel profound, yet be empty. Not empty because it is false, empty because it cannot be false. And a rule that cannot be false is not physics. It is not a discovery about phi. It is a spell made from definitions. It may be a useful bookkeeping identity, like a tidy way to keep your account straight, but it cannot teach us anything new about reality because reality cannot contradict it. To understand this, let me begin with an everyday story. Imagine you walk into a small shop on a busy street. The shopkeeper greets you warmly and says, "Everything in my shop is on discount today." You smile. You think you're about to save money. Then you point at a jacket and ask, "How much is that?" He answers, "That jacket costs 100 pounds, but because everything is on discount, its discounted price is the discounted price." You pause. You say, "Yes, but what is the discounted price?" He repeats, "The discounted price is the discounted price." At that moment you feel it. Something is wrong. He is using a sentence that cannot be wrong. No matter what the number is, he can say the same thing. He has not told you anything. He has wrapped emptiness in the language of a deal. That is a tautology. A tautology is a statement that is true simply because of the meanings of its own words. It is like saying, "All bachelors are unmarried men." It is always true, but it does not tell you any new fact about the world. It only tells you what you decided the word bachelor means. In science, tautologies are far more dangerous than in a shop, because they can wear expensive clothing. They can be wrapped in symbols like omega, kappa, and nu. They can be written as complicated equations. They can be presented with confidence. And whole research programs can be built inside them, like people building homes inside a mirage. So the tautology detection gate is the tool that asks, with cold honesty, is this law a contingent claim about phi, or is it a definitional loop that cannot fail? Let me say contingent in everyday language. Contingent means it could have been otherwise. It means the world had a choice. It means you can imagine a logically possible world where the statement is false, without breaking logic and without changing the meaning of the words. That is what makes a claim empirical. If it is contingent, you can test it. Phi can surprise you. Phi can say no. A tautology is the opposite. A tautology is necessary inside its own definitions. It cannot be false unless you change your definitions. And if the only way your rule survives is by changing definitions whenever it is challenged, then you have not learned about phi. You have only learned how to protect your language from contact with reality. This is why we call this a gate. It is a gate because it controls entry into the registry of licensed physical laws. A statement may be allowed into your analytic toolkit, but it is forbidden from being presented as evidence about the nature of phi unless it passes this gate. Now let us connect this to the Holophase triunity. We always speak in the triunity because it keeps us honest. Omega is the time shadow, the rate at which phi changes with respect to time. Kappa is the space shadow, the rate at which phi changes with respect to position. Nu is the motion readout, the coupling between omega and kappa, like the way a rhythm plus spacing produces a traveling pattern. A clever tautology can hide by mixing these. It can look like a deep relationship among omega, kappa, and nu, but after you substitute definitions and simplify, it collapses to a trivial identity, like something equals itself or 0 equals 0. The tautology detection gate forces us to do that substitution. It forces us to peel off the costume. Here is the simplest version of the test, spoken for audio. Step 1. You take a proposed rule, call it G, like rule G. It is a statement about phi and its derivatives. In audio, you can imagine it as G of phi omega kappa nu and perhaps other higher derivatives. Step 2. You collect the definitions that were used to build those quantities. Call the set of definitions D, like definitions D. These definitions include how omega is defined from phi and time, how kappa is defined from phi and space, how nu is defined from omega and kappa, and also how any other derived quantities are defined. Step 3. You ask a brutal question. Does D alone logically force G to be true? In audio, do the definitions already contain the rule, so that the rule is true before you even look at the world? If the answer is yes, then G is analytic relative to D. It is a tautology. It belongs in the analytic toolkit, not in the ledger of empirical discoveries. If the answer is no, then G is synthetic. It might be a genuine law of phi. It is vulnerable. It can be broken by a phi sentence, by a measurement, by a real observation. That makes it worth testing. That is the gate. Now let me make this vivid with a simpler story, because this is where people get tricked. Imagine you are teaching a child the rules of a game. You say, a goal is when the ball goes into the net. The child nods. Then a child stands up and announces with great pride, I discovered the law. Whenever a goal happens, the ball is in the net. The child looks proud. It sounds like a rule. But you smile, because you know it is not a discovery. It is only the definition of a goal repeated as if it were a law of the world. In science, people do this with more complicated words. The tautology detection gate is what smiles gently and says, this may be true, but is it telling us anything about phi? Or is it simply repeating our own definitions? Now, the gate is necessary because of a failure mode we call epistemic sterility. Epistemic sterility means you can publish, debate, and compute forever, but you never risk being wrong. You never touch a contradiction. It becomes an echo chamber. This can happen without anyone being dishonest. It can happen because humans love certainty. A tautology feels safe. It feels solid. It feels like a rock. But it is a rock made of words, not of reality. So the gate protects against projects that generate internal elegance without external bite. Now let us talk about a famous place where tautologies hide: conservation statements. Many people say energy is conserved, and they treat it like an eternal truth. But in the firewall, we ask, what do you mean by energy? In Holophase, we have a crucial demotion rule. Energy is tally. Energy is bookkeeping. It is a way of summarizing how phi is behaving in a licensed window. That demotion is not an insult. It is an operational blessing. It prevents us from worshipping the ledger as if the ledger were the shop itself. Now, if someone defines energy as the quantity that is conserved whenever the system has time translation symmetry, then the statement energy is conserved becomes dangerously close to a tautology. In audio, it says, the quantity we define to be conserved is conserved. That is like defining the winner as the person who wins and then announcing the law. The winner always wins. True, but empty. For energy conservation to be an empirical law, not a tautology, we must define the components independently of the conservation statement, and then we must measure them. So the firewall demands two things. First, independent definitions. For example, kinetic energy is defined from mass and measured motion. Potential energy from measured forces and positions. Thermal energy from temperature and heat capacities, and so on. The key is that these definitions do not smuggle in the conservation statement. They stand on their own measurement recipes. Second, empirical testing. We then go into a licensed omega kappa nu window, measure each independently defined component, and tally the total. The law is the contingent discovery that the total remains constant within uncertainty. It could have failed. If it failed, we would not change the definition to protect it. We would update the law or our model of phi. That is what makes it physics. Now here is another way tautologies sneak in, by hiding inside mathematics that is always true. For example, someone might define a quantity called informational flux, built from phi derivatives, and then show that its total through a closed kappa surface is conserved because of a mathematical identity like a divergence theorem. If that conservation follows purely from how the quantity was defined plus a mathematical theorem, then it is not an empirical discovery about phi. It is a bookkeeping identity. It may be useful, but it cannot be cited as evidence that the world is that way, because the world never had a chance to disagree. The gate's job is not to hate mathematics. The gate loves mathematics. But it refuses to confuse mathematical necessity with physical discovery. Now, to be a good conceptual auditor, you need a habit. Reverse engineering. Reverse engineering means you ask, every time you see a beautiful equation, what part is input and what part is output? What part was assumed by definition and what part is being claimed as a constraint on phi? Think of a cooking pot. If I define spice level as whatever tastes spicy to me today, then any statement I make about spice level will be safe, because I can adjust the definition after tasting. But if I define spice level as the grams of chili powder measured on a scale, then a statement about it can be wrong. It can meet reality. So the gate forces definitions to be explicit, and then it tests whether the rule is merely those definitions in disguise. Now let us give the gate a clear speaking procedure you can follow. Procedure spoken. 1. Write the rule in its cleanest form. Say what it claims. 2. List the definitions of every term and symbol. Do not assume the listener knows. State them. Omega is defined as the time rate of phi. Kappa is defined as the space rate of phi. Nu is defined from omega and kappa as a motion readout. 3. Substitute the definitions into the rule, replacing each defined quantity with what it is defined to be. 4. Simplify. Cancel terms. Reduce. 5. Ask. After simplification, does the rule still make a statement that a measurement could contradict? Or did it collapse into an identity like A equals A? If it collapses, you have a tautology. Now, The gate also has a unique falsification condition. It does not falsify the truth of the statement. It falsifies the claim that the statement is an empirical law. If no possible observation of omega, kappa, or nu could violate the rule, and any apparent violation can always be fixed by redefining a term within the rule itself, then the statement is not an empirical law. Its status as physics is falsified. It must be recategorized. This is an important point for audio listeners. A tautology is not wrong. It is simply not a discovery. It is like a mirror. It can reflect your definitions beautifully. But you cannot use a mirror as evidence about what lies behind the wall. Now we discuss licensing consequences, because the firewall is not only a philosophy, it is governance. If the rule is detected as a tautology, it is not burned. It is archived as an analytic invariant. That means you may use it as a consistency check, as a computational shortcut, as a tool inside models. But you may not present it as evidence that your theory describes phi. You may not claim it as a profound empirical support. It is moved out of the licensed physical laws registry into the analytic toolkit registry. If the rule passes the gate, meaning it is contingent and falsifiable, then it may proceed to other gates: scale stability, independence checks, regime variation, and so on. Now I want to give you a culturally grounded story to make this unforgettable. Imagine the administrators of an empire trying to create a rule for taxation of grain. They build a formula. Tax equals land area times yield coefficient times time factor minus subsistence deduction. In audio, you can say tax equals land area multiplied by yield coefficient multiplied by a time factor minus a deduction for families. It looks rigorous. It has numbers. It feels scientific. Now a conceptual auditor arrives. He asks, are these inputs measured independently from the outcome, or are they declarations that make the outcome true by definition? He discovers that the yield coefficient is not measured each year, it is fixed by decree. The subsistence deduction is not updated by census, it is a fixed traditional number. The time factor is declared by a local authority with no independent verification. The land area is surveyed, but the categories are flexible. So the formula produces a number, but that number is not anchored to independent measurements of actual harvested grain. If the villagers harvest less than the assessed tax, the formula is not considered wrong. The villagers are considered guilty, or the year is considered unlucky. The rule cannot be falsified by reality, because reality has no place to bite. So within that administrative language game, the tax rule becomes tautological. Tax is whatever the formula says, given the declared inputs. It is internally consistent, but it does not discover the empire's true resource base. It is an analytic machine for generating obligations, not an empirical law of production. That story teaches the pattern. A closed loop of definitions can produce powerful outputs while remaining unanchored from phi sentences. Now bring this back to modern science with a gentle warning. There are principles that can be empirical or tautological depending on how you present them. Take the principle of least action. If you postulate a specific function, sometimes called a Lagrangian, and then you claim the world's paths follow from minimizing the action built from that function, that claim can be falsifiable. A different world could require a different function. Experiments can rule out candidate forms. But if you define the Lagrangian as whatever function, when minimized, yields the observed paths, then you have created a tautology. You have said, the world does what it does because we define the function that reproduces what it does. That is not discovery. That is curve fitting dressed as principle. Another everyday domain is markets. If someone says markets are efficient, but they define available information and fully reflect in a way that can always be adjusted after the fact to match whatever happened, the claim becomes unfalsifiable. It becomes a tautology. Prices are what they are because of the information that made them so. To make it empirical, you must define information independently, specify measurable predictions about price response over time, and allow failure. The gate teaches you to demand that independence. Now, to make the skill concrete, I will give you the 3 questions a conceptual auditor always asks. You can use these as a mantra. Question 1. What is independently defined here? Are the key quantities defined without using the law itself? Question 2. Where is the empirical hook? At what point does this statement touch a measurement of omega, kappa, or nu that is not produced by the statement itself? Question 3. Is failure possible? If data disagrees, will you revise your picture of phi? Or will you simply redefine the terms until agreement returns? If the answers are weak, you are staring at a tautology, or something close to it. Now let us crystallize the central axiom this gate protects, because every part of metagrammar leans on it. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. A tautology survives falsification trivially because it cannot be falsified. That is not strength, that is emptiness. So the gate refuses to grant it the status of physical law. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. In this gate, the failure is that the rule is not contingent. So we do not argue, we recategorize. Now let me summarize the gate in a single story sentence that is easy to remember. The tautology detection gate is the guard at the entrance of science who asks, can the world say no to this statement? If the world cannot say no, the statement is not a law of the world. It is a sentence about our dictionary. Before we finish, I want you to hear what reduces to 0 equals 0 sounds like in ordinary life, because that is the sound of a tautology wearing a lab coat. Imagine a friend tells you, I have a perfect method for predicting tomorrow's weather. You ask, how? He says, tomorrow's weather will be whatever tomorrow's weather is. You laugh because it is obvious. But in science, the same move can be hidden behind substitutions. A scientist may write nu equals omega divided by kappa. That can be a definition of nu, a chosen readout that links time rate and space rate. If someone then claims a law that says omega equals nu times kappa, it looks like a new relationship. Yet if nu was defined as omega over kappa, then omega equals nu times kappa is simply the same definition written backwards. It is true by construction. No experiment can break it because it is not asserting a behavior of phi. It is asserting how we chose to speak. So the auditor's job is to check. Are we looking at a constraint or at a rearranged definition? This is also why the gate makes us separate 2 types of truth. There is analytic truth, true because of our language and definitions. It is like the statement, a triangle has 3 sides. It can be extremely useful. It can guide calculation. But it is not a discovery about the universe. Then there is synthetic truth. True because the world actually behaves that way. It is like the statement, rocks fall toward Earth in this regime. That statement could have been different. That is why it is testable. The gate is designed to stop us from confusing the first with the second. Now let me tell you a short parable about redefinition, because this is the most common way people protect a tautology. A student brings you a key and says, this key opens every door. You ask him to demonstrate. He tries a door and it does not open. He smiles and says, that is not a door. In my definition, a door is any opening that my key opens. his claim becomes unfalsifiable because he redefines the category to protect the claim. That is exactly what happens when a theory responds to failed predictions by redefining its terms instead of revising its claims about phi. So the gate includes a discipline. Definitions are frozen during testing. You may propose definitions, but once a rule is presented as a candidate law, you cannot revise definitions to dodge falsification. If you must revise, you must admit you are no longer testing the same claim. Now, because Holophase is operational, we also speak about licensed windows here. A licensed window is a declared observational context. Instruments, sampling rates, spatial resolutions, coherence thresholds, and uncertainty discipline. The gate asks, within a licensed window, can a phi sentence contradict the rule? If your rule is phrased so that every time a window produces contradictory data, you can say, that window is unlicensed, without having declared the license boundaries beforehand, then your rule is again sliding toward unfalsifiability. The firewall does not allow moving goalposts. Now we can state the output classification spoken clearly. If the gate finds that a proposed rule is implied by definitions alone, we label it analytic invariant. It may be precious as a consistency check, but it is not admissible as evidence about the world. If the gate finds that the rule is not implied by definitions, and that it implies measurable relationships among omega, kappa, and nu that could fail, we label it contingent candidate law. Then it proceeds to the other gates of the firewall. Finally, we close with a forward-looking warning, because the firewall is built for an adversarial world. Sometimes a clever mind can engineer statements that look falsifiable on the surface, but are secretly protected by hidden definitional wiggle room. That is why this gate must be practiced like a skill, not like a checkbox. One last practical tip for everyday thinking. When you hear a grand claim, invent a small counterworld in your imagination. Ask, what would phi have to do for this to be false? If you cannot name any possible measurement that would contradict it, no change in omega over time, no change in kappa over space, no change in nu as motion, then the claim is probably not a law. It is probably a definition, a naming convention, or a mathematical identity. But if you can name a clear observation that would break it, and you would accept that break as meaningful, then you are holding a real scientific question. Write that imagined counterexample down before you run experiments, so you cannot move the goalposts later when the results feel uncomfortable to your pride. So, as you continue the Holophase journey, keep this sentence as a compass. If the world cannot say no, you have not asked the scientific question yet. Salam and peace be upon you.